Everybody who knew and worked for Deanie liked him. He inspired friendship and loyalty on a scale not known in the underworld today. Reporter Edward Dean Sullivan with the Herald-Examiner, whose life the gangster once saved, explained his popularity saying, "Deanie O'Banion was as valorous a person as I have ever encountered." A former employee, one Mr. E. Barrett, was quoted as saying, "He was the best boss I had before or since. If I had trouble or needed money, he listened to me." J. Robert Nash writes, "He was a disarming fellow, lovable almost. Chicago newspapers fawned over him, chronicling his zany antics and quoting his wisecracks and butchered bonds mots. He was delightfully macabre copy, a walking fiction, the storybook gangster of the 1920s. He was also, according to Chief of Police Morgan Collins, Chicago's arch criminal, who has killed or seen to the killing of at least 25 men. But still, everybody agreed. To his friends, he was a pal of pals, but to those who crossed him, he was less than cordial." Wikipedia has his birth name as Charles Dean O'Banion, but his grave marker bears the inscription Dean C. O'Banion, and as if to make the whole thing more confusing, the newspapers of the day referred to him as Dion, although he never used that name himself. But to his friends, they used a more playful name for their boss, Deanie. Born July 8, 1892, in the small central Illinois town of Maroa, Deanie was born to Irish Catholic parents. By all accounts, he had a happy childhood even in the midst of the poverty which surrounded him. But in 1901, tragedy struck when his beloved mother passed. His father moved the family to the heavily Irish-populated area of Chicago's North Side, settling in Kilgubin, a section known as Little Hell, which had earned that moniker due to its reputation for vice, gangs, and rampant crime. Even in his new city, Deanie's father continued his devotion to the Catholic Church and took Deanie to Holy Name Cathedral, where he joined the choir and was praised by all for his strong tenor voice. But the church just couldn't hold his attention. Deanie's eyes drifted to where the action was, on the streets of Chicago. Along with his friends Earl Jaime Weiss and George Bugs Moran, O'Banion joined the Hellions, a division of the Market Street Gang which specialized in theft and robbery for the city's thriving black market. The lads later became sluggers for hire during Chicago's newspaper wars. On behalf of their employer, they would beat newsstand owners who didn't have the brains to sell the right paper. The young Hellions first worked for the Chicago Tribune, but later switched to the rival Herald-Examiner due to a more attractive offer from newspaper boss Moe Annenberg. Through Annenberg, the gang allegedly met safecracker Charles the Ox Reiser, who taught the ambitious crew his trade. The gang also met the political bosses of the 42nd and 43rd Wards. Seeing their value, Annenberg hired the gang to persuade voters on Election Day to cast their lot for candidates he backed. Carl Sifakis writes, "The oft-quoted joke of the time was, 'Who'll carry the 42nd and 43rd Wards?' The answer was, O'Banion in his pistol pocket." In 1909, at the age of 17, O'Banion racked up 2 arrests, one for safecracking and the other for assault. These were the only 2 run-ins with the law in which he ever spent any time in jail. When Prohibition became the law of the land, O'Banion saw dollar signs. He set up distribution lines and began importing Canadian liquor across the border. Everybody was drinking, and O'Banion and his Northsiders were soon rolling in the dough. Reports state that Deanie was netting nearly $1 million a year. That's over $12 million in today's money at the beginning of Prohibition. On December 19, 1921, Deanie and the boys received a large order for Canadian whiskey, but they didn't have enough inventory in stock. So Deanie devised a plan to hijack a truck from a competitor. The plan was executed without a glitch. The hijacking became the first known incident of what turned out to be a common and often bloody exercise in Chicago's underworld. Employing iron-fisted tactics he learned as part of the Market Street Gang, O'Banion eventually eliminated all competition on the north side of Chicago and the Gold Coast. With money to burn and police protection in his pocket, Deanie decided it was time to settle down. He married the 18-year-old Viola Caniff, and needing to show a source of legitimate income, he purchased an interest in Schofield's Florist, a flower shop near the corner of West Chicago Avenue and North State Street. The rooms above the flower shop became the headquarters for Deanie and his North Side gang. His inner circle of trusted aides consisted of a group of sluggers and killers like Earl Jaime Weiss, Vincent the Schemer Drucci, George Bugs Moran, Dapper Dan McCarthy, Two-Gun Louis Altieri, and the Gusenberg brothers, Frank and Peter. The North Side gang was predominantly Irish, but O'Banion really didn't care about one's ethnicity. One of his most faithful and trusted friends, Vincent Drucci, was himself Sicilian. Citing again Carl Syphakas, O'Banion formed an alliance with many Jewish gangsters of the old 20th Ward, especially those working with Nails Morton, and the gangs more or less merged. When Morton was killed in a horseback riding accident, the grief-stricken O'Banions exacted the proper underworld revenge by executing the horse. Things were going well, perhaps too well. By day, O'Banion was a prosperous florist who made a fortune from gangster funerals, supplying wreaths to those who had departed this world, oftentimes by his own hand. By night, he supplied cards, dice, and liquor to his territory's citizens who desired the taste of alcohol. But turf soon became a volatile issue. Johnny Torrio, who headed up the South Side mob, believed the squabbles over territory would hurt everyone. And so he brokered a peace accord in which the city would be divided up amongst the various gangs. Everyone agreed to Torrio's suggestions, and for roughly 3 years, peace reigned. But the original deal had cut the Torrio mob in on the action in the Gold Coast, and as part of this agreement, O'Banion was called upon to help Torrio get his man elected as mayor in Cicero, a suburb of Chicago. After O'Banion fulfilled his obligations as spelled out in the peace accord and Torrio's man was elected as mayor, Cicero became a gold mine for the Southsiders. O'Banion believed he had a right to some of the profits. To pacify him, Torrio granted O'Banion some of Cicero's beer rights and a quarter interest in a high-stakes casino called the Ship. But O'Banion wasn't satisfied. Underhandedly, he persuaded a few of the more popular speakeasy proprietors who had establishments in the Southside territory to move their business to his territory. He promised they would be treated better and would no longer have to buy the rot-gut liquor and green beer Torrio and Capone peddled. When Torrio found out, he first tried to convince Deanie that his actions could spark a war. He begged O'Banion to abandon his plan in exchange for some proceeds from the numerous whorehouses he and Capone operated. But O'Banion refused. For all of his faults, he believed prostitution was against the Holy Mother Church, and throughout his career, he never got involved in that racket. In fact, he looked down on Torrio and Capone for forcing young girls into prostitution, often referring to them as pimps. As the rivalry flared, the Jenna brothers, who had gained control of sections of Little Italy west of the Loop, began picking off O'Banion customers, forcing them to buy their homemade whiskey. O'Banion took his complaint to Torrio, but Torrio did nothing. O'Banion, who felt he was being cheated by the Jennas, especially since one of the brothers, Bloody Angelo, owed a casino Deanie was part owner in more than $30,000, retaliated by hijacking Jenna liquor shipments. By 1924, the peace accord was all but gone. In February, O'Banion believed his time to make a move against Torrio and Capone had come. He tried unsuccessfully to frame Torrio and Capone for the murder of Northside associate John Duffy. O'Banion had played a dangerous hand and lost. He had now not only made enemies of the terrible Jenna brothers, but also their downtown sponsors, Torrio and Capone. The final break came as a result of the Seabin Brewery sale. Torrio and O'Banion both owned a large piece of the brewery. In May 1924, O'Banion learned that police planned to raid the establishment and shut it down. With his hat in hand, O'Banion approached Torrio, telling him he wanted to sell his interest in Seabins and retire from the rackets. The price tag was $500,000, $6.2 million in today's money. During Prohibition, a first arrest for violating the law was nothing more than a fine and a slap on the wrist. A second violation could garner at least 2 years in the county jail. A third arrest, well, that depended on the judge, who could give the violator between 10 to 20 years. O'Banion knew Johnny Torrio already had one arrest for violating the Volstead Act. A second arrest meant jail time for sure. On May 19, 1924, O'Banion met Torrio at the brewery. Money changed hands, and the would-be rivals closed the deal with a handshake. Moments later, the police busted in. O'Banion, because it was his first violation, got off with a fine and a warning. But Johnny Torrio was headed to jail. Torrio quickly realized that he had been double-crossed, and he demanded O'Banion return the money he had given him in the deal. But O'Banion refused, and now his fate was sealed. On November 8, 1924, the Southsiders, along with the Jenna brothers, made their move to take out Deanie O'Banion. Mike Merlo, head of the Unione Siciliana, had just died of cancer. They knew his funeral would be perfect cover to approach O'Banion without raising any suspicion. Though no one knows for certain, it is believed that Capone called on his old childhood chum Frankie Yale from New York and 2 of Torrio's gunners, John Scalise and Albert Anselmi, to do the work. Under the pretense of picking up a funeral wreath for Mike Merlo, Yale and his men entered Schofield's. An employee of the shop, who was working in the back room, stated that the men were smiling as they walked in. The tallest of the 3 was in the middle, flanked by his 2 compatriots. J. Robert Nash describes what happened next. The tall man grabbed O'Banion's hand in a greeting. The 2 men at his sides moved around Deanie and drew pistols. Then, at close range, while the tall men held O'Banion in a vice-like grip, bullets ripped into the Irish gangster. 2 in the right breast, 1 through the larynx, another one next to that, another in the right cheek, and another coup de grace shot through the left cheek. Throughout the underworld, this became known as the handshake murder, and Deanie O'Banion had the privilege and distinction of being its first victim. 15,000 people attended O'Banion's funeral, and of course there were truckloads of his favorite flowers delivered to the graveside. J. Robert Nash adds this final note. Though Cardinal George Mundelein refused to allow O'Banion to be buried in consecrated ground or any last rites administered to his corpse, Father Malloy of Holy Name Cathedral knelt next to O'Banion's casket as it was being lowered into the unblessed earth by his gangster friends and enemies, and said 3 Hail Marys and the Lord's Prayer. The priest remembered O'Banion only as the smiling, blue-eyed choir boy in his church, not as a gangster. Unfortunately for Torrio and Capone, who had hoped O'Banion's death would finally bring peace, Chicago became a war zone. Even in death, Deanie's friends sought revenge for the killing of their beloved boss. The Jennas were the first to go. Next, the Northsiders focused on Johnny Torrio. They almost got him, and though shot and left for dead, he was able to pull through. However, fearing for his life, he eventually fled the Windy City, turning his crime empire over to his friend Al Capone. Though the war raged for nearly 5 years after O'Banion's death, Capone, who eventually became fed up with the Northsiders, ended the conflict with a spectacular 60-second shooting on St. Valentine's Day in 1929.